I'm Heather Huff. I'm the Executive Director of PACE, and we're thrilled that you're here today to talk about English learners in California. This is part of the Getting Down to Facts series, which I think most of you are probably familiar with now, but I'm just going to do a little bit of framing about what Getting Down to Facts is and how this piece of work is oriented within the larger set of studies. So Getting Down to Facts is a national collaborative research project. We had over 100 researchers who were involved in it. It produced 36 reports and 19 research briefs. It was a sequel to the Getting Down to Facts study from 2007, which really was, at that point, designed to take stock of some of the challenges that we were facing as a state and start to chart some paths forward. It is often credited for some of the big changes that we have in the state, including the local control funding formula. So our goal was to bring a lot of strong researchers to the job of taking another hard look at California education policy. In the development and execution of these studies, we worked together very closely, and we also had the input of multiple stakeholders so that we knew we were representing the most kind of strategic and high leverage problems for California. We covered 4 basic areas across policy areas from pre-K through higher education, focus on K-12, student success, so just looking at how our students are doing, governance, how are our systems set up, how are they performing, personnel, and finance. Some of the studies today will cover multiples of these points. Some of our key findings are that California schools and students have been moving in the right direction. We've implemented a lot of changes over the past 10 years that have broad support and actually some evidence that they're leading to change in student outcomes. But we need to do a lot of work to support the system to fully realize the promise of these changes. One of the big things that we need to focus on is building system capacity, so strengthening our systems so that everybody at all levels are actually capable of and ready to implement the Common Core state standards, to locally allocate funding in ways that's best for kids. But we also need to increase funding. We made progress in terms of allocating more money to the kids that need it most, but California still lags very far behind most other states in terms of per pupil funding, and that's something that we need to pay attention to and that we've in recent months been hearing very loud and clear from the field. And then finally, we just can't lose sight of the fact that we still have very large achievement gaps here in California. And that many of these gaps are apparent when students step foot into our K-12 public school system. So this points to a real need for California K-12 system to close those gaps, and also a need to strengthen our early childhood education systems. So I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers and then turn it over to them as quickly as possible. 3 speakers, sorry. So I'm gonna do very brief bios because I don't want to spend a lot of time. Lucrecia Santibañez, Associate Professor at Claremont Graduate University School of Education Studies. Lucrecia studies ELs and teacher workforce issues. Christine Snyder is a PhD student in education at Claremont Graduate University and a co-author on the report for Getting Down to Facts. And then finally, Ilana Umanski, who's an assistant professor of educational methodology, policy, and leadership at the University of Oregon, and a former Stanford PhD. So we're going to first have the presentation by Ilana, and then Lucrecia and Christine. And we're going to leave ample time for discussion, so you can ask questions of our presenters. You can raise issues for the room, and we just look forward to that being a really robust and lively discussion. So without further ado, Ilana.
Let's see. Oh yeah, that's working. Hi everybody, it's really great to be here. So basically we're going to be talking about the 2 Getting Down to Facts reports that really focused in on English learners specifically. One of the really nice things that I appreciated about Getting Down to Facts is that English learners are actually touched upon in a lot of the technical reports. So if you're interested in English learners with regard to a specific thing, be it facilities or something like that, you can look at these other reports, and there usually are parts that address English learners within them. My particular technical report I'll show you the questions first, address two fundamental questions. First, what does research suggest are pressing policy areas regarding English learner education in California? And then once identifying those policy areas, for each of those, what's the status of California law and policy? And what additional state actions could the state take in order to improve English learner experiences, opportunities, and outcomes? So just to give a little bit of context, as probably everybody in the room knows, California's English learner subgroup is large, diverse, and faces large equity barriers. So we know, and I think it's oftentimes said, that 1 in 5 California public school students is an English learner. 38% of California's K-12 students are ever English learners in the ever English learner category. So that means that they entered school as an English learner. So that is a really important part of our K-12 population, a really important part of the population that we need to have a strong eye on. The policy context, this was an exciting time to work on this report because California has taken great strides in the last several years with regard to English learner policy. So these are some of the big things that have happened: the English learner roadmap, the ELA-ELD framework, the ELD standards, Prop 58 passing, and then also some sort of state level things that aren't specific to English learners but that relate to them a lot, like LCFF and the state education priority areas. It's also an exciting time because of the passage of Prop 58 that we see rapid growth in bilingual programs. I was just at a Getting Down to Facts event in Southern California, and the director of EL programming from LAUSD said that 3 years ago they had 40 bilingual programs in LAUSD, and next year they'll have 180. So just massive growth in terms of these programs. So that's another exciting opportunity, but also a challenge for the state to make sure that these are really high quality programs. And then finally, as we all know, there's really large equity gaps in both access and outcomes for English learners. And this graph is just to remind us of that. This red line here, if you can see it, is English-only students, and this is the proportion of students who are meeting the CAS-BLA standard. So it's about between 50 and 75%. This is English learners here, between about 5 and 20% by grade level. So really large achievement gaps, but at the same time, there's diversity within this group too. So this black line up here is reclassified English learners. So reclassified English learners are actually doing really quite well in the early grades, even better than English-only students in terms of the proportion that are meeting state standards. So that's the context. The purpose of this report was really to identify these areas, and I identified 9 core English learner policy areas that are important for EL outcomes. And I organized them by the principles of the English Learner Roadmap because, as I say in the bottom there, I really wanted this report to be able to be used as a tool for both state and local implementation of the EL Roadmap, since that's such an important thing that's going on in the state right now. For each of the 9 policy areas, which I'll show you in a second, I give a summary of the state of research, and then concrete policy implications of that research base for that particular policy area. So there's our roadmap. And then these are the 4 principles of the roadmap. And here are the 9 policy areas that are important for English learner education organized by the roadmap principles. So let's see if there's a little light here. So the first one, in terms of assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools, is a policy area about addressing diversity in skills and needs. And I was going to hone in a little bit on that one today in talking about newcomer students, but I think I'm not going to have time to do that. But if there are questions about that afterwards, we could talk about it. The second principle is about intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access. And the policy areas there are English learners' access to core content, high-quality integrated and designated English language development supports, and bilingual education. In the third roadmap principle, system conditions that support effectiveness, there are 3 policy areas there about teacher preparation and skills, and Lucrecia and Christine are going to talk about that one in a lot of detail in a bit. English learner assessment and EL funding. And then finally, in the fourth principle, alignment and articulation within and across systems, the policy areas are pre-K through grade 16 alignment and reclassification. And those are the two that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth today. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that all 9 of these policy areas are covered in some depth in the technical report, less so in the policy brief that I think you have in front of you, but the technical report that's on the Getting Down to Facts website. So if you're interested in any one of these areas and where sort of the research stands with regard to any of these policy areas, please know that that's a resource for you, and there's a lot of details on each of these areas. So as I said, I'm going to hone in on these 2 policy areas because I understand that these are really up-and-coming current issues in California right now. I'm a Californian, but I'm now up in Oregon, so I'm trying to keep a pulse on what's going on. So I'll start with pre-K through grade 16 alignment, and then we'll talk about reclassification after that. So basically what I'm going to do is just sort of give a little summary of where knowledge stands. So basically, the summary of this section of this, this policy area is that English learners' schooling is currently fragmented between the pre-K, the K-12, and then the post-secondary education systems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, each of these systems has their own set of policies and rules. The most sort of emblematic example of that is that the concept of English learners only exists in K-12, right? It doesn't exist in pre-K. There's a concept of dual language learners in pre-K. Or higher ed. So that's sort of just a very basic example of the sort of lack of articulation between systems. And what we know is that this lack of articulation is impacting students, and it impacts English learners particularly in particularly dramatic ways. Pre-K, which actually serves the highest proportion of students that we would think of as using that term English learners, pre-K serves the largest proportion of English learners. And we know that high quality pre-K is very important for English learner students, that students that are in high quality pre-K enter K-12 with greater school readiness and higher English proficiency levels. One of the things that's been shown to be particularly important in high quality pre-K for English learners is home language instruction, getting them a strong literacy and pre-literacy base in their home language that they can then use to acquire English once they're in K-12. I mean, they acquire English in pre-K as well, but that home language instruction in pre-K has been shown to be particularly important. Then, once they get in, there's this important link in terms of preparing English learners for success in K-12. The same is true from K-12 to post-secondary. So we know that there are a lot of barriers in the K-12 system for students reaching post-secondary. Those barriers have to do with full access to content, segregation between schools, lack of sufficient support through college counselors, a lack of understanding with, helping families and students understand what is the application process, what schools should I go to, all those kinds of questions. So there's a lot of barriers. And in fact, a recent study shows that kids that have not reclassified by the end of 8th grade are half as likely to get a BA than students who have, EL students who have reclassified by the end of 8th grade. So there's really important barriers, particularly at that secondary level, for getting English learners into and completing higher education. Not only that, but another thing that the research finds is that the kinds of barriers that are in place in K-12 that we know about, such as limited access to core content, are in place at the other levels as well. And in particular, there's a growing body of work at the post-secondary level that students who have a dominant language other than English, even those who have reclassified, tend to be in lots of remedial level coursework at the higher education level, and that remedial level coursework, there's important work by Michelle O'Dara in this area, that remedial level coursework actually slows them down and makes it less likely that they complete their associate's or bachelor's degrees. So they're very similar types of barriers, and that's another reason not only is it important for kids to have that alignment, but it's also important for the systems to be able to learn from each other, since there are so many sort of replicated barriers across the systems. And then finally, the last point is that our understanding of the relationship between these three levels and how kids do as they progress across level is very constrained in California because of the absence of a comprehensive data system that links kids from pre-K through college. So what are the policy implications here? First, increasing access and enrollment of students who are acquiring English in pre-K and providing home language, high-quality home language instruction in pre-K. Improving those high school to college links. Developing a statewide individual level comprehensive data system, and I understand there's some movement in that direction in the current budget, so that's really exciting and very important for the state. Increasing higher education supports and policy actions at the higher education level to try to support kids who were English learners in K-12 in being successful as they go through higher education. And reviving sort of more cross-level collaboration. So for instance, state-level councils for P16 alignment, things like that. Okay, so the second thing that I'm going to talk about is reclassification. I know that that's a somewhat of a controversial issue, and there's opinions in a lot of different areas. And I'm going to try to lay out what the research base shows about reclassification briefly. So the main summary here is that reclassification policies are very consequential for students, and yet implementation in California has been highly variable and somewhat arbitrary in places because of the sort of district level autonomy in terms of reclassification criteria. So first, why is reclassification consequential? Well, we know that reclassification itself has effects for kids in terms of their access to courses, their access to teachers, their access to peers, and their access to resources in school. And we also know, and there's a growing body of work that shows that reclassification actually impacts students' outcomes. It impacts their likelihood, as I was saying, of going to college. It impacts their likelihood of being able to graduate from high school. And interestingly, reclassification can impact kids in different ways. So there's an interesting study out of Oregon by Joe Simpian and Karen Thompson that looks at this, that finds that in some districts, reclassification is beneficial to students, and in some districts, reclassification is harmful to students. And what we're increasingly understanding is that if you reclassify kids really early and don't have linguistic supports in classes, then reclassification can be detrimental for students. If you reclassify kids really late and you withhold them from core content access before you reclassify them, then you're harming them by not reclassifying them. So it's really about, and I'll talk about this more in terms of the implication, but it's about trying to balance how we're serving kids and reclassification. That they're not two separate things, they're very linked together, and I think we don't think about that enough. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the criteria for reclassification and the research base about that. So California, as you know, up until now has an academic criteria for reclassification, which is the English Language Arts state assessment. And the idea of academic criteria is that it serves to indicate whether a student is prepared to be able to succeed in the sort of academic mainstream without supports. And there's also an argument that it can keep pressure on EL programs to make sure that kids are getting access to academic content. So those are sort of the main arguments for an academic criterion, but there are a number of problems that have surfaced in the literature base about those academic criteria. So first and foremost in my mind is that how you perform on the state ELA test is a direct reflection of the ELA instruction you have received. So if as an English learner you are not getting full access to English language arts instruction, then you end up in a catch-22, where it's very difficult to meet the reclassification criteria threshold because you're not actually getting access to that instruction. And in that sense, it sort of penalizes students for something that the system should be providing them. Another complication with academic criteria has to do with bias in scores. That we know that for kids acquiring English, their test scores, even with accommodations, are biased. So that's another, and we're sort of taking those scores as truth when we know the research base is very clear that we know that those scores are downwardly biased for these students. We also know that as students advance in grade, those academic criteria become more and more the main barriers that they need to cross. So in early grades, kids tend to not meet the English language proficiency criteria for reclassification. In the later grades, kids tend not to meet those English language arts criteria for reclassification. So that's another problem, is that as we get advanced in grade, we're holding kids back, not because of their English proficiency, but because of their academic preparedness. Finally, it's holding English learners to a standard that we're not holding non-English learners to. We don't limit non-English learners' access to mainstream content based on their academic preparedness, but we are limiting English learners' access to content. So those are some of the main research-based problems that have been identified with academic criteria. Second, I want to talk about subjective non-standard criteria, because here again, the idea I think is a very strong one, which is that we want to draw upon the expertise of local actors, of teachers, of administrators, of EL specialists in making those reclassification decisions. That's important, and I think if California moves forward with this teacher observation protocol, language observation protocol, that's sort of the main motivation of that in some ways, and to have a second English language proficiency assessment. However, there are some problems that are associated with this in the literature base, and I'll show you a graph in just a second about the bias issue, but first just to start with the non-standardized issue. So here, for instance, like let's say you have a GPA as a criteria. What a student's 3.5 in one school in a particular set of classes means a completely different thing than a 3.5 at another school in a different set of classes. So if you hold that non-standardized criteria as a reclassification criteria, you're really holding kids to different standards. And that's true with non-standardized assessments as well. The same kind of issue comes up. And then second is the issue of bias. Unfortunately, we know that teachers as humans hold implicit biases. And I want to show you some work that I've been working on lately that is not published yet, but that we're submitting for review, so you're getting sort of a sneak preview here. But this, if I can just sort of briefly explain it, this is estimating the likelihood of reclassifying by grade based on ethnicity. The circles are Chinese English learner students, and the triangles are Latinx English learner students, based on whether they were eligible to reclassify based on test scores or not eligible. So these are kids who met, this is district level data from California, these are kids who met the test score criteria for reclassification, and these are kids who did not meet the test score criteria for reclassification. So what you can see here is that Chinese English learner students are more likely to be reclassified regardless of whether they met the test score criteria or not. That to me suggests that there's some sort of biases, systematic ethnic and racial biases that are in place here. So it's an important cautionary note about non-standardized and subjective reclassification criteria. And finally, fewer criteria for reclassification may be better. The more criteria you have, and some important work by Peggy Estrada has shown this, the more confused the whole system becomes in terms of trying to get kids through those barriers. When do we identify them? Which criteria are we using when? There start to be a lot of more administrative errors and oversights for kids the more criteria you have. And also, it becomes more likely, Karen Thompson has shown this, it becomes more likely that a student will be held in EL status because they missed one criteria. Let's say 1 year they missed the GPA criteria, the next year they missed the ELA criteria, the next year they missed this criteria, and it just becomes, can become sort of a more and more difficult process for kids to be reclassified. So policy implications, removing the link between English learner status and curricular access. Trying to make sure that English, whether you're an English learner or not, you have full access to content and resources in school will make reclassification less consequential for students. mapping linguistic supports onto, what do I mean there? Linguistic support should map onto required proficiency level. So what I mean there is that you need to set the services, the linguistic supports in school, to map on closely to where you put that reclassification threshold, so that you're not reclassifying students early, but then not providing them linguistic supports in school once they're reclassified. Simplifying criteria complexity, removing academic criteria, and limiting to non-subjective criteria. So in conclusion, this technical report identifies 9 critical policy areas for EL education. We just talked a little bit about 2 of the 9, but the other 7 are in there. And it embeds those policy areas within the English Learner Roadmap. It provides a review of current research in each of those 9 areas and outlines what are policy implications of these research findings given what we know in terms of where California is now and where it could be moving to. And my hope is that in doing this, it's a tool in thinking through state-level English learner policy and supporting the implementation and actualization of all the progress that California has been making and will continue to make in the upcoming years. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it over.
Thank you, Ilana. Can you hear me okay? All right, so let me segue a little bit into our Christine and I presentation. So what Ilana laid out in a way, and this is also in the research brief and in her report and our report too, is this is a story that you can frame it as an opportunity to learn story, right? And so there are 3 elements to this opportunity to learn. There's the access to core content, linguistic supports. There's the access to equitable and adequate reclassification and assessments, which you didn't a little bit about, but that's a big area too that's touched on the report. And the third element of opportunity to learn for English learners is having adequately and well-prepared teachers. And so we have a whole report just devoted to teachers because we felt this was such an important area that if we did not look at how teachers were being prepared and supported to teach English learners well, you can have access to content, you can have the other things, but if it doesn't happen in the classroom and if the kids are somehow being inequitably exposed to teacher resources, it's not going to bode well. At the end of the day, this is an equity story, right? And so we are making the point that these kids are being made vulnerable by policy, so to speak, because these are things that we can control. These are things that we can change. And how teachers are prepared and supported are things that are within the state's control, that are within, in the preparation realm, within the state's control, and then support and professional development more within district's control. So our report, Christine and I, touched on how teacher credential requirements in California addressed English learner needs. Ilana already mentioned this, but I hope that this becomes the talking point, how everyone starts their conversation when they talk about English learners, because it's kind of surprising. If you live, like many of us do, in an English learner world, you would be surprised that you have to convince some people that this is actually important and should be at the forefront of the discussion. So it's not, we've mentioned this, like it's not a niche topic. This is a topic that actually is relevant for almost half of our kids, at least when they enter. So Ilana already mentioned the 38% diverse group. You have newcomers, you have long-term English learners, you have English learners, so they are all going to have different needs and abilities. And the key thing for our purposes is that today, all teachers in California, pretty much all teachers in California can expect to have English learners as part of their classroom. I did want to make a note, there's an asterisk here, and I speak for the 3 of us. We're not crazy about the term English learner. In the context of getting down to facts, that's what we use, that's what the state uses, but I did want to acknowledge that there are other terms like dual language learners or emergent bilinguals that probably are better suited to refer to this population. So let me go back to this point. So all teachers in California can expect to have ELs in their classroom. And even though many English learners exit designation as Ilana said, the median time is about 5 years. So you have a lot of kids that are entering secondary school, middle school, that are still designated, and that's the really risky part of their education, where a lot of the tracking and a lot of these not great things happen. And that's precisely an area where teachers have a very important role to play. All right, so not only do all teachers in California can expect to have ELs in their classroom, but actually English learners are more likely than non-English learners to be taught by early career teachers. So it's not just a question of, are all teachers prepared? But it is actually very much a question of, are our new teachers prepared, right? Because more likely than not, those those schools with high proportions of English learners, because we're such a segregated system, are going to be getting a lot of those novice teachers. And there's a puzzle here. So if you look at the California Teaching Credentialing Commission, their completer surveys, teachers come right off the bat feeling super effective, right? So you ask them, how well prepared do you feel? I see a lot of heads nodding. This is common. I'm sure many of you are teachers and have either talked to teachers or experienced this yourself. They come out of preliminary. Of course, we have an embedded model, so ELs are all over, and Christine is going to talk more about this. So they're like, yes, I'm super prepared. I can do this. I totally can do this. Single subject credential teachers are a little less gung-ho, but they're still, very much so. Once they're clearing their induction, first year of teaching, enthusiasm starts to wane a little bit, because maybe they're actually realizing that, teaching one focus EL student is not the same as teaching 4 levels in the same classroom. And once you go to teachers who've been in the field for at least 3 years, this is a survey from LAUSD, they're not enthusiastic at all. They're actually feeling the heat. They feel very challenged. They feel they're not adequately prepared. They need to have more skills and more knowledge. And so the puzzle is if we have an embedded EL authorization credential model in California, and if induction in their first year out of preliminary is supposed to be touching on this, why are teachers feeling so unprepared after this whole process? So our overarching finding is that, first of all, again, something that will not be surprising in this audience, but it is surprising for other people, is that teaching English learners is not just good teaching. It is good teaching, but it goes beyond that. You need specialized knowledge, dispositions, and practices. And so Christine's going to talk about what we mean by that. And new teachers in California receive some of this training in pre-service because of the embedded model, but yet do not feel adequately prepared, because as we will see later in this presentation, our preparation model is full of missed opportunities to develop these skills further. There's also a very important role that we don't go into it that much in this paper of professional development and in-service support, which plays a very important role too. So I'm going to pass it over to Christine, who's going to talk about the actual paper, and then I'm going to circle back to conclude.
Thank you. Okay, so our research questions were, let me make sure I'm proceeding. Okay, the first was, to what extent is the teaching of English learners addressed by credential requirements? And the second was, to what extent does credentialing require teachers demonstrate proficiency teaching them? So the first question is, to what degree are they addressed? And the second is, to what degree are teachers assessed in this area? So we used a qualitative design. So we had a small sample. We looked at 4 candidates moving through induction and 7 induction personnel. We observed the teachers several times. We interviewed everybody, and we collected. So that during data collection 2016 to 2018, they were still using FACT, the old formative assessment. So we collected all of their FACT. We read everything that the teachers submitted for induction. And we also did a real comprehensive review of CTC documents, the program standards, everything having to do with setting policy for credentialing. We read the CalTPAs. We looked at the CSDP. And so we supplemented that content analysis with the small sample qualitative analysis. So we started by saying, okay, well, what does the literature say teachers of English learners need to know and be able to do? And so, as Lucrecia mentioned, it's not just that they're good teachers. There are specific, a specialized form of knowledge. So we divided them, and we're using lots of other folks' looking at work that Lucrecia has done with Francesca Lopez, and how would we categorize that? So we can say there's practices, there's knowledge, and there's orientations. So I'm just going to really quickly go into that because it's going to frame the findings. I'm going to start with the middle one. The knowledge is what are the broad disciplinary domains? Linguistics. You got to know about linguistics. Okay, what else do you have to know? Well, for example, you have to know how to assess your English learners. You have to be able to take their, if you're an English teacher, take their writing, or if you're a science teacher, take their labs, and look at what they've produced and assess it. And then based on your assessment, be able to tailor individualized instruction to meet their individual needs. That's a very complex set of knowledges. The practices are the observable things the teachers then do in the classroom based on that knowledge. So, okay, I know that my lab reports came back and I see different needs in my students. So what am I going to do the next day to address those needs? And then the orientations piece is the personal dispositions. What Ilana was speaking about, why is there this issue with reclassification differing across racial, ethnic lines? Well, the idea that we should be valuing linguistic diversity, that we should be addressing issues of bias. So that's a really important thing that teachers need to have in order to serve their English learners well. So our findings, the first research question was, to what degree does credentialing address those three categories? So as Lucrecia mentioned, it's very strongly emphasized in preliminary. Okay, we have the Cal TPA, it's all through the TPEs. Preliminary really emphasizes ELs. Student teaching or field work, it has to be in settings with linguistic diversity. But induction is really not focused on ELs. And the key takeaway is that last bullet point, which is, while ELs may be addressed in induction, this is not guaranteed. So I'm going to drill down into what that means in the next slides. The second question, to what degree does credentialing assess teacher competency in these areas? And we found that there are proficiency requirements, but they're kind of soft. So in preliminary, you do have to show evidence of proficiency teaching ELs, but there's ways in which those, like the Cal TPA, they happen in really controlled settings. But the key piece we want to emphasize for this discussion is in induction, teachers really are not required to show proficiency teaching ELs in order to clear. And just to clarify, preliminary is the credential you get in order to get a full-time job. Of course, there's lots of teachers who are teaching on other emergency or other credentials, but then once that happens, you then have to clear it for it to be permanent. And the clearing process or induction is when you're in the actual classroom, your first classroom, and you actually have 120 kids, and you're working with a mentor to address your real world teaching issues. So why is that? So we're going to explain. Induction is very personalized, okay? The whole process is built very differently from preliminary. The new teacher is working with the mentor to set a target, an area of focus. I'm really struggling with this aspect of my practice. Mentor, can you help me and come every week and observe me and give me feedback on that? And the teacher is involved in setting that goal for him or herself. So because it's very personalized, ELs and other areas, specific areas, may not be emphasized because the extent to which it is emphasized depends on the extent to which the mentor and the teacher identify that as an area of focus. So it's true that among our teachers, induction did require that they attend to their English learners in various ways. We're going to say that in a minute. But we can say that proficiency really is not required. And the key piece I want to highlight is the second to bottom bullet point. The language in the policy, the program standards, is this. Induction programs must assess candidate progress toward mastery of the standards. So that's different from assessing mastery. So can we say that all the teachers in this state who have a clear credential are assessed as proficient in teaching English learners? No, because it's not even a requirement that they show all the elements of the CSTP, that they're proficient in those. So we'll give you some examples of what that means. This is a data table from the paper. We collected the plans where the teacher articulate, now it's the ILP, but where the teacher sets, what's my area of focus? So teacher 1 was really concerned about, I want to make my curriculum more innovative. Teacher 2, I really want to make my small group interactions more effective. Third was, I want to work on student empowerment in my class. And teacher 4 was really thinking about brain breaks because she was a high school English teacher and she just felt that students' engagement and focus wasn't always what she wanted to see. These are great. These are teachers who are super committed and innovative in their questions, but none of them are working on addressing the needs of their English learners. And remember, in this personalized process, that is the target area for induction. Another piece of data we'll show is this table. The no, no, no's mean we collected the notes that mentors wrote as they observed teachers. We actually read what the mentor wrote. And then we also read the teacher's reflection on the conversation they had with a mentor. And we went through, and in each part of that, we looked at, is our English learners addressed? And when we went through all these passages, in fact, they're not. The single yes, sorry, I lost it, but that one yes box was the one example where there was a reference to ELs. I'll show you another example. I mentioned this idea that teachers need to be able to assess student work and then tailor instruction based on it. So in the induction program we were studying, they used the focus student model, which is, okay, go into your classroom and collect work from 3 focus students: an English learner, a student with special needs, and then a student of your choice. So that's a really powerful kind of case study way for teachers to improve their practice in meeting the needs of different kinds of kids, right? Sounds great. So we collected the work that they submitted to their mentor for the English learner case study student. So this is from a high school English class, and what she submitted as the EL work was a check-the-box self-assessment, okay? The kindergarten teacher submitted from the EL work, the kindergartners taped on or pasted the parts of a flower. This is a 7th grade history teacher, like teacher 1. Their EL work that they submitted was a self-assessment. You can see like the question at the bottom. When was the last time you told someone that you appreciated them? Why? The student wrote yesterday. And then the last piece of work is the high school history teacher. She had the students write about the Missouri Compromise in an extended fashion, but it was a group project. So what Ilana mentioned is very true here. Subjective non-standard criteria. How do we know? Based on this, first of all, there's not a lot of data for a teacher to analyze. If I'm looking at a check-the-box self-assessment, that's not going to give me a whole lot of information about my language learners' needs. And yet that teacher was permitted to, in the context of induction, submit that as evidence of their EL focus student. Last piece, this extended writing, a lot of text there, great data for language ability or language level, but it's a group project. So we don't know the degree to which this teacher really knows that the English learner produced that evidence. So just 4 things we want to highlight. Induction really privileges self-assessment. But that's a very powerful strategy in terms of developing reflection. But in terms of addressing English learners, it has limitations because, as Lucrecia mentioned, we know that early career teachers may have inflated self-assessments relative to what an external observer would observe. So if the process hinges on the teacher identifying an area of need, if ELs aren't often on a new teacher's radar, that group of students is not going to land in that teacher's self-assessed area of need. And also the way that they were allowed to substantiate their self-assessments, there was a lack of clear criteria. There are few external assessments of proficiency in teaching ELs. In preliminary, there's a great deal of, there's the CalCPA, right? We have lots of measures for assessing candidate proficiency. But in induction, assessment happens largely internally within the program. And, but we know, so for example, the mentor is a huge part of this process, but we know from research that there's a lot of variability across mentor training and the degree to which mentors are trained, how well they're trained, and specifically how well they're trained to meet the needs of their English learners. The problem with how ELs are constructed in policy. ELs are not a monolithic group, right? There's a difference between my newcomer and my LTEL, long-term English learner. But the focus student strategy never asks the teacher, show me how do you differentiate within the category of EL, right? An EL, you can't just say, I differentiate for ELs. Well, what does that mean? And another thing we want to highlight is that in the policies that we read, and this is often, you'll see it everywhere. ELs are often grouped with special needs students. The language will be like, candidates will show proficiency in meeting the needs of a range of learners, including, English learners and students with special needs. Well, this is a really problematic potential conflation of very different student profiles. It was unclear to us if teachers can use assessment data in the way that I opened with the importance of that skill. It is emphasized in preliminary, but there are ways that, like we said, that assessment is soft. It could theoretically be addressed in induction, but the process doesn't guarantee that will happen. In our sample, our teachers didn't even necessarily have their language learners' levels at the beginning of the year. We had one teacher say, I had to go ask my friend who happens to be the EL coordinator, can you give me my data? And then once they had the data, they weren't necessarily sure what to do with it. We had one teacher point blank tell us, why are there five CELT levels? I don't understand. So this was a teacher moving through induction. Yeah.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, is this on? Yeah. Teachers of English learners do need specialized knowledge. Some of that is recognized in the embedded EL authorization in the preliminary credential, but induction lacks a very clear systematic focus and can be a missed opportunity. Today, all of this is in flux. It's changing how the procedures, the rules, the guidelines. It's actually giving more autonomy to programs to determine what those benchmarks are, how to set those proficiency levels, how to set those competency levels. So it's even going to be more important now than ever that programs, TPPs, teacher preparation programs, and induction providers have clearer guidance as to what constitutes acceptable evidence, what constitutes competency, what constitutes mastery. We know that teachers are not going to come out of, even after a year of induction, as masters of anything. I mean, none of us are ever masters of anything at any point. But we do need to ensure that they are touching on this, particularly because, as we said earlier, this is a big group of kids, and they're getting newer teachers more than other groups of kids. So we need to ensure that the learning curve of the teachers, that the English learners are not sort of completely falling through the cracks and suffering from those learning curves initially. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Good job. Thank you. To any questions, comments, reflections, anything that moves you? Yeah, can the speakers go up to the front? Thank you. Yes.
This is for Ms. Snyder and Santibañez. Did you take a look at all at the bilingual teacher education preparation programs and to see what gaps there may be and what improvement or how can they be improved with regard to teacher preparation? And this is not personal against you, but
That's a great,
okay.
It's working? Yeah, that's a great question. We did not. We only looked at sort of monolingual, teachers who were being prepared to work in mainstream structured English immersion classrooms. That's still the majority of the classrooms in our state. But it does open up a really important point because as dual language instruction basically explodes, we need to be paying a lot closer attention to what's happening in those programs because the B-clad for many years, and this depends on the program. Some universities and programs do a much more thorough job, but in some cases, if you pass the languages exam, and take one course, you're basically a bilingual teacher, which that may or may not be. It's an empirical question, but it's definitely worth studying further.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Umansky. Is that how it's properly pronounced? You commented that with respect to the issue of reclassification, there's a real problem of curricular access being denied to students. I was wondering if anything in your work helped you to quantify that. And as a quick example, I recently was a presentation regarding special education kids in math, and 6th grade special education kids in math in this study were shown to be doing about 3rd grade work in their pullout. Can you give us any sense of what's happening to EL kids as a result of this loss of curricular access?
I should have planted you in the audience. That's my favorite question. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of my work examines exactly that question, quantitatively trying to look at what kind of curricular access English learners have, particularly in middle and high school. And I've talked about 3 ways in which English learners face inequitable access to content. The first is something that I call exclusionary tracking, and that's where English learners are just less likely than non-English learners to even be placed in a particular core content area class. And where we see that most dramatically is in English language arts. There are large proportions of English learners in middle schools and high schools who are in no English language arts classes, which is very problematic because of graduation criteria. Now, California has taken a big step in the right direction in passing law that prevents districts from excluding non-newcomer ELs from the standard core curriculum, but right now is a pivotal moment in terms of making sure that that law is implemented and enacted by districts, because a lot of districts have formal and informal policies in place where English learners at levels 1 and 2 cannot be placed in a math class or cannot be placed in an English language arts class. In addition to that exclusionary tracking, we also see 2 other patterns of tracking for English learners. The first is leveled tracking, where English learners are disproportionately in lower level classes. They have much less access to honors, AP classes, and they're more likely to be in remedial level classes and not in the grade level equivalents. And then finally, we see these parallel classes, and those are classes like sheltered instructional classes, which are not necessarily problematic if the content in those classes is really strong and equitable. The problem is that a lot of qualitative research that has gone into those sheltered classes finds that those classes tend to have present less core content at less rigorous levels and using less beneficial pedagogical practices within the class. So those are 3 kinds of ways in which English learners have less access to core content. And I've got a few publications about it, so I can direct you to those if you want to see those.
Is there a divergence on the education of English learners between charter and public?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I know is that there's been, when you probably there's people in the audience that know more about this, but that I hear through the grapevine that some charters, are very focused on supporting their ELs, and then some charters are not focused on supporting their ELs. So there's sort of more variation in the charter world than in the public world. But I don't know that. That's just what I hear say.
The room that wants to speak to that has some knowledge on that point? Okay. I'll come back.
Hello, hi. I was wondering if there's any thoughts on reclassification for school districts with a large, what do you call that? So they have, so say for instance, LA Unified has 60 different languages, whereas maybe a rural district may only have 5 languages. So is there any background on how fast like a school can reclassify their students?
Should I take that? Yeah, so that graph that I showed you is part of a larger study that looks at differences in reclassification rates by home language and ethnicity. Particularly, that one looks at particularly Chinese origin and Latinx English learner students. But there are some other studies, like there was a study out of the California Legislative Analyst's Office from like the early 2000s that looks at variation in timing to reclassification by home language, and there are these very large differences, which is what we're trying to tackle, the why in our question. And we think a lot of it has to do with the kinds of resources and experiences that kids are exposed to that vary systematically based on race, ethnicity, and home language.
And this is also a reclassification question. You commented as you were looking at the research, that it may make sense from a policy perspective to actually narrow the number of indicators and make it less complex. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I just think it's really relevant in our policy context. Where we've seen that work and what the impact has been for kids. Are there other states that have said we're only going to use the language assessment and one or two other things, or just the language assessment, and then what that meant for a child's not only their access to the curriculum, but then ultimately their outcomes? Did they go, were there higher rates of graduation? Did they go off to college and complete? So just being able to put a little bit more evidence behind that piece of it would be helpful.
That's a really great question. I don't know the answer to the second part of the question, which is there research trying to compare reclassification outcomes between places that use more criteria and places that use less criteria? I think that would be a really important thing to question to try to answer. I do know that increasingly, because of the kinds of problems that research is identifying regarding having multiple criteria in place, and problems associated with having academic and sort of more subjective criteria, that more and more states are moving towards English proficiency only criteria, and in some cases just the one criterion of the state's English language proficiency assessment. So for instance, New York, which is one of the other states with high proportion of English learners, has recently gone in that direction.
I just wanted to add something. This is actually a very highly contested area, because when I've talked about this issue with Ilana, it makes total sense to me to have only the language proficiency criteria, because this is, the services are related to language, if you're getting the services or not. So reclassification should only be, in theory, related to that. But when you pose this to people who are working in districts or teachers, they don't like it at all. And that always gives me pause, because if the people who are sort of working with the students feel that there needs to be more information, I think that's sort of important to know. At the same time, because we know the degree of bias that teachers have, and Ilana presented a really interesting study, but there have been other studies that teachers have very unconscious biases and they're not even aware of them. And so I think this is a really thorny one, and I do agree that having that research, maybe we should do that research, would be really important.
Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to tack on, I also work in some higher ed areas, and we're kind of going the opposite way in community colleges, where we found that just having an assessment was really placing students into remedial education and disproportionately. And so the state, through AB 705, has been actually shifting to include other measures, multiple measures. So I just think it's interesting how we're kind of going, and I wouldn't say in totally different directions, because I think that the state is being thoughtful about those multiple measures and trying to limit things like bias, but there has been a lot of work on how just having a single assessment can also underplace students disproportionately. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
I'll mention one thing and then I'll give it to Ilana. I think part of the complication is what Ilana mentioned about this research that finds that in some districts, it works to be like the services you're getting, it may be worth staying reclassified longer because those services are good or not. I feel that every district, because they're so different in the quality of the services that they're providing and in the quality of the core content, it's almost like a different treatment in every district, right? Like this is not like you reclassify and automatically everyone gets the same. Everyone gets something different. So I think that's part of the challenge with reclassification in K through 12.
As I mentioned, I'm up in Oregon now, and one of they're also talking about and thinking a lot about reclassification right now. And one of the things that's been on the table is the ability to use multiple measures to push kids into reclassification, but not to hold kids back. And that's an effort in Oregon to try to minimize bias. You could see bias still operating in that way, because if teachers are systematically trying to push their Chinese origin ELs through without passing, because, you know, as you saw in that graph, a lot of kids are reclassifying without meeting test-based criteria. So you could still see bias surfacing in that way, but it would be less likely to surface in a way of holding students back from reclassification. So yeah, I agree with what you said about there are some real risks about having just a one criterion reclassification rule because of issues of you know, measurement error in tests. Did that kid eat a good breakfast that morning? So I think California is thinking well about this issue and trying to think about potentially having multiple measures of English proficiency. I just think it's important to think about how to minimize subjectivity in that teacher language observation protocol. How do you minimize bias in something like that? And there probably, this is my area of expertise, is not assessment, but there probably are ways to try to design that tool to minimize bias.
I had a question about credentialing. When you looked at both pre-service preparation and induction, do you feel like you saw kind of up-to-date instruction being promoted, integrated and designated ELD, for example? I'm curious about just the quality of the preparation itself.
You mean in our observations of teachers, or in the looking at the policy itself?
I'd say looking at the policies, the programs of preparation, or the practices within induction to support new teachers. So I'll answer it. Tell me if I'm getting to what you're asking. If you look at the standards, the standards that teachers are supposed to be able to show proficiency in, at the preliminary level, they're the TPEs. In when you're clearing and when you're in the profession, it's the CSTP. The preliminary teacher standards have ELs, support for ELs all over the place. I mean, it's very present. When we look at the CSTP, the CSTP, there's 6 standards, okay? There are 6 buckets. They're subdivided into 38 elements. Of the 38 elements, 2 explicitly address English learners, and then 2 implicitly do, because they talk about diverse students and things that could theoretically. So if you're talking about the practices that our teachers are being equipped to show proficiency in, just a coding of the standards suggests preliminary is really holding teachers to a level, a standard, that is absent, or it's omitted in induction simply by virtue of the standards not having that language. Is that addressing your point?
Yeah. I think if you're thinking, to add to what Christine said, if you read the documents, you see a lot of the literature there. So everything that's there is very thoughtful. It's very well, researched. It's in the right place. I think the issue with English learners, and those of you who are teachers or have worked in classrooms will, I'm sure, resonate with this, is that when you're in the classroom, things can get very complicated very fast, and it's gonna vary year to year. So if you have one year where the composition looks like a certain way, and then a different year where the composition is different, it's a completely different ball game, and there's nothing in your preparation that has sort of where you have had to face that, which is why we put so much emphasis in induction, because it's kind of really hard to do these things theoretically. When you're a student, you're learning so much. It's almost impossible to put it on preliminary, because it's like teachers are already sort of overwhelmed, right? When you have a coach, that's when you're supposed to be supported and mentored, and the coach will have had experience and said, oh, well, you can differentiate this way, or you can, what we saw in our observations, the only differentiation technique or support or tailoring or addressing or whatever you want to call it was pairing an EL with a native speaker across the board. It didn't matter if the teacher had 4 levels, 2 levels, 1 level, 4 ELs or 15 ELs. That was the one technique. So I think that in induction, even though in the documents is state of the art, the induction kind of goes back to what the teacher and the coach know and want to do. And that may not be state of the art because there's nothing that forces that interaction to be state of the art or to be in a certain way, because induction is highly personalized. And I feel that, you know, Chris Hadley mentioned this at one of the other PACE meetings in October. It's great to have a lot of autonomy and personalization and have everything be tailored. But there are certain issues that are too important to kind of not have them be part of the conversation across the board for everyone. And I feel strongly that this is one of those. But because everything is personalized, it's really up to the program and up to the coach, whether the coach wants to steer the teacher there.
So we are out of time, and so what I would encourage, just to make sure we close up for everyone that needs to get out, the speakers are going to be around and they're more than welcome to talk. But please join me in thanking our speakers. We have 2 remaining PACE seminars, one in April and one in May, on finance adequacy and on data systems. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do. We look forward to seeing you at a future event.